Gary McGowan, welcome to CamBro Conversations. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I was swithering between introducing you as Gary McGowan or Skinny Gaz. What do you think you're going to identify as in the future? Is Skinny Gaz here to stay?
Gary is fine. I do get a kick out of it when people say skinny guys are right, because it's funny, because it's sort of satire, sort of serious, but yeah, I get a kick out of it. But Gary is fine for today.
Yeah, I think it's funny when you've got like such a strong online brand, particularly in a local area, and like when you're out and about, somebody's like, "Oh, that's Skinny Gaz," rather than "That's
Yeah.
Gary." Like it must feel quite good from a marketing perspective, but funny from a human perspective.
Yeah, it is funny from a human's perspective, because I never think of myself as being someone who has a lot of followers, but because, like you say, the place I'm from and the areas I frequent are quite small areas, so you often do get people who are like, "Oh, are you that guy, that skinny Gaz guy? Are you the fitness guy?" And it's like, "Oh, that's very strange." My girlfriend always gets quite uncomfortable about it, because it feels in that moment like you're way more famous than you are. It's just that you're in a very small pond, but yeah, it's still nice.
It's massively amplified, and sometimes you find these people aren't necessarily people that like follow you really closely, but they've seen your stuff at some point,
Yeah.
and particularly if it's like a venue where there's alcohol being consumed, they're a little bit braver to come across and ask like, "Oh, is that who you are?" And you're like, yeah, like no big deal, like let's have a
Yeah.
chat. It's a funny one. I guess you mentioned there the fitness guy, and one of the things that's happened to you recently is you've had a hamstring injury, and
Mhm.
you spoke around how that's impacted your identity. Given that you wear so many different hats, Gary, like how would you describe your identity?
Mm. Yeah, I love this question and this topic more broadly, because I think that identity is actually a really important part for both an individual and broad on a broader societal level. Where do people derive their identity? I think it's really important. You see this obviously playing out culturally in terms of things like the culture wars and identity politics. People allowing their beliefs to be very much attached to a sense of identity, and then that inhibiting them from being more rational in the way that they think. That's just one very broad example of why identity is so important. And I spoke about this a little bit recently on my Instagram, where I said that one of the protective factors for me not deteriorating psychologically in response to my injury, the surgery, and subsequently being immobilized, was the fact that my identity doesn't just rest on being a fit person. It's definitely a big part. Like, I definitely do feel myself that I like to think of myself as being a fit person. I would like others to see me as being a fit person. It's definitely important. But what also comes into that is another probably core one, is that I think of myself as being someone who works hard and gives 100%. Like, that's another big core part of my identity. And the good thing about that one is that that's actually it's not specific, it's general. So it means that whether it's fitness or my own education or my work or whatever it happens to be, that identity, the things that contribute to that component of my identity are a bit more malleable, a bit more flexible. So whether it's in the presence of illness or injury or anything else, it's always going to be there. So that for me is definitely a big component of my identity. I think that probably is pretty clear if you follow me. Like, that's one of my big messages for me personally. It can go too far at times, but I'm a big fan of hard work, give 100% regardless of what you're doing. So that's a big part of it.
The fact that
There
it's
are other
applied in
components.
different, the fact that you're able to apply it in different areas of your life as well is that's what spoke to me when you were describing that. Yes, I can't train in the same way that Gary traditionally does and he's known for, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not the only thing that defines me and the only thing that I find value myself in. In fact, I'm going to apply this hard work and the effort that I've maybe got, the kind of energy that I've freed up from training into business, studies, and all the different other facets of your like relationships, even that you're able to turn up fuller because of the freed up capacity from the training layoff.
100%. And, like you say, it did give me extra energy that I was able to allocate to different areas. And that was something that was definitely of benefit. And yeah, I think that in general, people should try to have some components of their identity that are non-specific and that don't hold them down too much, because you never know what's going to happen in life, whether it be, financial catastrophe where you lose all your money, or you have an injury and you can't train anymore. Or I even know some people locally, friends of mine, who have had, severe injuries that left them paralyzed. And how you cope with that is how you cope with any significant traumatic event or catastrophe like that is very much dependent on where that sense of identity, that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose comes from. And if your identity is attached to something non-specific, I think that's very sustaining, and it's something you can carry over somewhere else. Because when I think about all of the lessons that I've learned during my time training in the gym and the skills I've gained from that, it almost feels to me internally like they're directly the exact same skills that I apply to studying, for example, because it was going to the gym that actually made me start studying and be a slightly more academic person, because I was like, oh, if you can have some discipline, get organized, have a plan and follow through, you get results in the gym. And guess what? That also works for your exams and these other things. So that's basically what my whole life is built around. And as a result, maybe my cognition will decline and my brain mightn't work as well. That's fine. I'll go to the gym, and maybe I'll get injured and I'll go to the books, but hopefully not both.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's a short term thing for you, like you said. And equally, one of the people that helped introduce us was Jack Kavanagh, who I guess you were maybe hinting at towards theirs.
I didn't even put that together, actually. Now, when I was just talking about that, because he's someone that came to mind, I totally forgot that there was a link there.
Yeah,
and
Jack's been on the podcast, and he has an incredible way of framing the tragic incident that he had.
He's
And
brilliant.
now he lives this fulfilled, aligned life
Yes.
that is not reliant on the fact that he was this young, like athletic guy when he was younger as well, which I think there's a lot to be learned from. And equally,
Yes.
sometimes somebody at that end of the challenge of perspective puts what maybe you've experienced, which albeit is a serious hamstring injury,
Mm.
in the cold light of day. It's not as challenging as potentially what it could have been.
100%. And he's a fantastic example. He has an unbelievable attitude, big inspiration for me. I think early on in the kind of pandemic times, I think he interviewed me on his podcast. We had a chat, and he's just an outstanding guy. And Ian O'Connell as well is another guy that some people will be familiar with in Ireland. He's from Killarney, my hometown, and I know him personally. Again, great guy. Pretty much the exact same case as Jack Kavanagh. And yeah, when I injured my hamstring, I think I was initially talking to Ian about it. Or he said something like maybe get well soon, or sorry to see you like this, or whatever. I'm like, dude, how can I complain? It can always be worse. And I think those guys maintaining their attitude like they do is very inspiring.
Yeah, I think you can take a lot from these individuals, and equally people like yourself who perhaps like rupturing the hamstring might be one of your followers or somebody who's consuming your content worst fear. But to see you go through it, it's actually quite helpful for them to see how somebody deals under that sort of situation as well.
I was actually very surprised at how many responses like that I had gotten, because see, I've never had a severe injury before, to be honest. And I know like theoretically, and I know from working with other people, because I help people through these situations, how psychologically challenging it can be. And then there was a lot of feedback that people were getting benefit from me talking about my experience, or maybe they were impressed that I wasn't that affected psychologically. And that kind of caused me to question, like what was it about me myself that I didn't get too upset by this? And again, it was going back to those things that we discussed. So I think, to be fair as well, like, while I say that you shouldn't attach your identity just to one thing, I do think as well that in some cases you might have to, because like the greater the thing that you're aiming at, the greater risk you have to accept as well. Like, for example, if you're a professional footballer playing with, Liverpool, Manchester United, whoever, you pour your whole existence into that from when you're a kid, and everything you've worked towards is there. And of course, that's going to make up a major component of your identity. There's huge potential reward in that you're getting paid whatever, $500,000 a week. But there's also huge potential risk. If you get a severe injury, now you're left with nothing and no education, no skills, etc. So I don't want to just say that everyone should wear all these different hats. It's totally acceptable to specialize. Just note that there's some risk there as well.
Equally, your identity is quite value based in terms of hard work, but it's applied across multiple different vectors.
Exactly.
What role do you think your family and your upbringing played in your ability to have perspective and experience with your identity? Because you mentioned professional football there. I know that's something that was kind of close to your family story as well.
Yeah, my family have definitely been incredibly influential, and I always credit them for, you know, anything I've achieved, because my dad was, you know, very much had that attitude of being a hard worker when he was a kid, because as you alluded to, he um, became a professional footballer himself, and played with Leicester City, but due to, you know, being falsely accused and charged with murder in Northern Ireland during the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, his career was basically stripped from him. And that's a whole 3 podcast discussion in itself. But basically that led to him having to go on the run, you know, flee his country, flee his career, not be able to pursue his career as a professional footballer. Played alongside, you know, Gary Lineker, same team, and now every day, you know, he's watching Match of the Day, Sky Sports, whatever, and Gary Lineker is there across the TV in front of him, knowing that they were on par. And that's a very difficult thing for him. And I think that when I reflect on his story, the fact that he put in so much work for one specific purpose, and then it was stripped away from him in that manner, in a way, I almost feel like it feels like a bit of a duty to try to carry on his legacy, or pick up what he didn't get the opportunity to do, even if it's not necessarily in the same domain of soccer in this case.
But there's massive nobility in that, isn't there, Gary? Like nobility in that cause to like, right, I'm going to carry on the McGowan legacy in terms of living an intentional life in the way that we should do.
100%. And I like that drives me more than anything internal, is when because he's quite an emotional guy, my dad, and he will get, you know, really emotional when he, you know, thinks about me like training to be a doctor, or when I graduated from physio. Just these types of things that are very meaningful to parents. Like, he loves that, and he relishes any opportunity to talk about what I'm doing and those types of things, without rubbing it in people's faces. But seeing that pride that he has in me is just, it's one of the biggest motivating factors in my life.
It must be a huge reward. Like, you're living the life that he has enabled you to live by.
Yes.
Having a stable relationship and producing children, and giving you the foundation to go and study at school and apply yourself at Cork or Limerick, I think you were studying at. So I really like that. And I actually know he gifted you Man's Search for Meaning, which is a book that I've referenced many times in the podcast in the last few episodes. Oh, did you give it to him?
Yeah, I gave it to him.
Talk to me about what you learned from that book, Gary.
I'm trying to think about where did I say that online that I gave it to him? Did I gift it to him? Maybe I did, yeah. Good spot. Good remember. I actually forgot I'd given it to him, but no, he definitely didn't give it to me.
I go deep in my research, Gary. Don't you worry.
I'm scared now. But no, yeah, I gave that book to him a few years ago, because it's obviously something that, like, I suppose for context, like, the book is written by Viktor Frankl. It's about his time, and I guess his psychological journey, and maybe some of his psychological observations during his time in, was he in Auschwitz, or was he in, he was in Auschwitz. So in Auschwitz, obviously during the Holocaust. And I think that book was the reason I gifted it to him, was because basically what Viktor Frankl comes out, you could summarize the conclusion as being that you can find meaning in these horrible situations, and that can be sustaining. And my dad has obviously had a very, very hard life, and that continues to affect him. So I think that, you know, having that perspective can be very useful. And that's kind of what I took from that book, and what I've taken from some other books that I've read as well about similar atrocious situations, is that no matter how hard things get, there's always something that people can cling to, and having something that maybe makes you feel useful, that you can contribute to, I think that can pick you up even in the darkest of times. And that's kind of what I recall from that book, with the knowledge that it's been, I don't know, 4 or 5 years since I read it, probably.
Yeah, I've read that book, and I've read a similar book, The Forgotten Highlander by Alistair Urquhart, which is a very similar.
What's that called?
The Forgotten Highlander. It's
Oh yeah, I've been recommended that, but I haven't read it.
yeah, it's right up your street, Gary. Like after this, I'll give you more of a review of it once we
Nice.
finish recording. But yeah, it's superb, and again, it gives you that perspective of how much humans can struggle and put up with and move forward and not be broken.
Mhm.
And if we can apply that to the relative comforts of the Western world that we experience now and the relative hardship which we find maybe super challenging, then we can be all the better for it. And I guess when it comes to your identity, one of the interesting things that you shared online was that you actively try not to just be the fitness guy. And one of the ways that you do that is through not necessarily always talking about it.
Yeah.
How do you manage that, particularly if somebody comes over to you and says, "Oh, Gary, like, are you the guy that does Triage Method, or are you the guy that talks about fitness online?" Like, how do you try and move the conversation away so that people aren't always necessarily talking to you about
Well,
reps and sets and nutrition?
anytime anyone talks to me, and I think this is just kind of, I guess, good etiquette, generally good practice. I always try to turn the conversation on them. And sometimes people are reluctant because they will like want to know more if they've been following you and stuff. But like I'll always try to turn around and say, tell me about your work, and then they'll give me a response, and I might know that much about it, but I'll find something interesting. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, tell me more about this, that, and the other, whatever. People love that. I think that's a good skill to be aware of, whether it's in male-female dynamics or just normal conversations that you have every day. Like, be interested in other people. Like, don't ever think that you can't learn stuff from other people, regardless of how menial you might think their life or job is. I find that to be a valuable way of conversing, and people generally appreciate you more. And it sometimes it can be kind of uncomfortable if someone has followed you, let's say, and again, I don't have that many followers, but if someone has followed you and they put you on this pedestal and they think of you as just being the fitness person, I find that if I'm conversing with them then, and I turn it around on them and get real interested in areas of their life, suddenly we're kind of on par now, and we can have an equal conversation, even if they are asking me about fitness. It just feels a bit different. So that's one of the things I do. I often try to take the conversation in the direction of the other person, but also, I suppose, more broadly, just to talk about other things with people, and to I try not to play the expert in person that much. So like, if there's a conversation, let's say I'm with my girlfriend and a few of her friends or her family, and a conversation comes up about a health topic or a training topic or something, I'm not jumping in and sharing all of my knowledge with them. I might wait until someone asks me, and then, share a couple of points. And if they want me to elaborate, I will. But I try not to make it so that if people were looking around the table, or they were looking from a third person view, they say that's the fitness guy. So obviously you want to be helpful, and I'm telling the truth and answering their questions, but I rarely try to force it on people, because that's not how I want them to look at me either. So there are a
I
few
really
of the
like that
things, I guess.
approach.
Yeah.
That particular approach, I think, is very helpful, because it means that people are maybe soliciting your advice.
Yes, exactly.
And equally, sometimes when somebody asks for something, it's because they actually truly want it. Whereas I suppose if it's just a general conversation and you're like, actually, I know about that and I can help, and which of course you can, but you become quite a dominant force within conversations in that regard. And it's really, really interesting for me that you mentioned that you sometimes try and turn the conversation round, so the other individual who perhaps has approached you or wants to talk to you about fitness in particular, you turn it around on them. Because I had a conversation specialist on the podcast, a lady called Celeste Headley, and she was telling me that the only conversation that people, well, there's two really, arguments is one, but the only other conversation that people leave with less dopamine and less serotonin is when they feel like they've been lectured. So
Yeah,
when we sit
100%.
within a lecture hall, we typically don't leave with high levels of serotonin and dopamine, because we've just been spoken at the whole time and it's not like interactive. Whereas when you've opened it up and you're like, well, tell me a bit more about your situation, and then you feel like there's a bond between the two of you, because you've started to share details about each other that aren't just a case of them saying, oh, Gary, like, tell me a bit about this, and then you just go bang, and then absolutely mic drop them on with all the knowledge that you of course can unlock, but you instead bring them into things. And that's probably why you have, albeit what you're saying is a smaller following, but you've got a very deep connected following.
Yeah, I do think that's true. I think that like, when I post, I almost always see the same people liking, the same people commenting. I can predict who's going to respond to my stories, and those types of things, because they're like, I like having engaging followers. I like being able to recognize names. I like when someone messages me, I remember that they messaged me before. All those things are really important to me, both in the real world and online. And I think that what you just said there, again, totally. What was it? What was I going to say? Oh yes, very interesting in terms of the flipping the conversation around on someone, because I think that this is something that we do extremely poorly in the fitness industry when it comes to maybe like debunking culture, like evidence-based fitness professionals or nutrition professionals that want to get their point across. They make the other person feel stupid, and they make the other person feel totally overwhelmed. One of those two things. And I find that if I want to change someone's mind and they're conversing with me, let's say I'm talking to someone at college or maybe a friend or something, and they start telling me about their ketogenic diet that they read about or whatever, and they're having a great time. What I always try to ask is, all right, tell me about your experience. Tell me what benefits you've noticed. And I first and foremost try to establish some common ground where we're both appreciating the results that you've gotten, and the discipline you've demonstrated and these types of things. And then they'll be like, yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think there's anything I should do differently? And then I'll interject with, well, maybe you should eat more vegetables or whatever it happens to be. This idea that you can just come online or go into someone's face and be like, this is stupid because this study and this study and this study, like, it doesn't work. It's
one of the
just not.
best sales trainers I ever had, Gary, away from the podcast, I work in a business development role. He said that so many salespeople do what's called prescription without diagnosis, and you'll enjoy that from a medical background, because if, for example, somebody starts telling you about their keto diet and you then start prescribing them the correct approach in your eyes, you've not actually diagnosed them, because you don't understand how it fits into their lifestyle, what happens,
Yes.
because there's probably a small percentage of people who the keto diet is actually quite good for, but
Mm-hmm.
it's probably not this individual. But until you hear the information about how they put it into their lives, what they've experienced with it, you shouldn't really be prescribing or giving out a prescription of, well, actually, you should probably look at having a more calorie accounted for diet with the following nutrient groups within it that will help you adhere to it on a longer term basis, instead of just kind of verbally throwing up and shouting things like calorie deficit at them glibly.
Yeah, 100%. But I do think that all of those things we just touched on are like more broadly just trying to develop your communication skills. And when people think about that, they might think it's using bigger words or being clearer in your speech. That's not necessarily it. It's part of it, but it's also those other soft skills that allow you to have an effective conversation with a person in terms of them feeling valued. But then if you're in a sales role or you're in a convincing profession where you're trying to elicit behavior change, communication skills are absolutely just essential, because otherwise you've got all this knowledge and you can't relay it on to another person, and that's a poor use of your knowledge.
That's so right. And clearly you've worked very hard on your communication skills, because it comes across really, really well. But I know that you initially, as a teenager, were coaching jump style of all things in terms of the kind of the dance style. Do you think you were born to coach, or do you think you've nurtured it over time?
Definitely nurtured over time, but I have always really enjoyed, I guess, passing things on to others, if you will, or teaching / coaching in some way. Like even that jump style that time, loved it, really enjoyed it. Just, we were probably 16 at the time. So we had, kids between maybe 8 and 13 that were coming in. They had seen the dance on YouTube and the scooter videos and things like that, and they wanted to learn. And I got a great kick out of that. I loved it at the time. And I've always loved coaching since. And obviously, given that I've studied in healthcare, I enjoy that kind of interpersonal element of healthcare and medicine more broadly. It's not just the kind of science or the theory type of or component of it, but also the act of actually helping someone or relaying on information. So yeah, I do get a lot of value from it. Was I born for it? I'm not sure. I was born to enjoy it, maybe, but it's definitely been nurtured over time.
Is that how you've made quite a lot of your decisions then? Because you mentioned there healthcare, you mentioned physio previously. You have made some pivots during your life so far. What's helped you make some of these big decisions? And I guess to bring the listeners up to speed, like you completed you started exercise science and then changed to physio, and you've made some big decisions along the way. Like what's allowing you a framework to make these, albeit quite life-altering decisions?
This is, I get asked this a lot because I think a lot of people really struggle with big decisions, and understandably so. And I wonder sometimes, do I make them a bit too easily? Because I suppose I initially went into exercise science, as you said, and I finished the first year of that, enjoyed it, but I was kind of studying that material already because I was just extremely interested in the gym and adaptations to exercise, nutrition, etc. So I thought, why not get a professional qualification? So that was the initial decision there was, well, wouldn't it be better to have to study something that you're not going to study anyway if you're going to pay for university and have a qualification? So yeah, that's what prompted me to do physiotherapy. And then the decision to go on and do medicine was actually a much more sporadic decision than I think a lot of people would probably think is normal. Where like when I initially had the thought, it was almost between the thought was something I took seriously and the decision was executed within genuinely 24 hours. Like it was that was just in my head and that's where I was going then. There had of course been some thought leading up to that, and I just felt that at that point in my life I was in a very, very lucky position where I have triage. So I have a source of income that doesn't require me to be anywhere during particular hours, in that it's flexible. I can work my own hours. And also it doesn't require me to be anywhere physically in terms of location. So I can be flexible in terms of where I'm based or where I'm placed, etc. So I was in a situation where the I had the finances to be able to, allocate that to studying medicine. I had the opportunity in terms of the time, that's arguable, to be able to study medicine. And then I had obviously interest in medicine that I had developed. And not only that, but also that the anything I gained from medicine would also benefit triage. So it's almost like this weird back and forth where what I do with triage allowed me to do medicine, but what I gain from medicine will also benefit triage. So I think I had a bit of a safety net there that made that decision easier. Like if I had just come out of physio and I had no job and I had no savings and I had no business and I had no alternate path, studying medicine would have been a much, much bigger call, going into debt and all that type of thing. But I think that probably helped me.
Yeah, I find it intriguing, and I always like to ask these questions of guests that have made decisions which the general public are like, "Oh, right, okay, well, I kind of trying to figure out why you've done that and how you've done that." But when you get into the nitty gritty, and you're like, "Well, actually, Gary had some financial reassurance in his head.
Yeah,
He had some safety nets. He probably had the backing of his family and his support system once he
100%.
explained his situation." Because a lot of the times people are like, "Oh, I can't make a decision because my family wouldn't understand." And sometimes you're like, well, they definitely want the best for you. And equally, our parents tend to be more conservative with a small c
Yeah.
about particular decisions because they want us to be in the most safe position possible. And so finishing a physio degree and going into a physio job would have been quite a safe choice for somebody who didn't have some of the other external factors which you've raised there.
And I think also, I think your parents' advice is incredibly useful because I think parents are better at thinking across a decade or multi-decade time frame in terms of what's best for you. That's what they care about. Whereas when we're in our 20s, in particular your early 20s, 3 years feels like such a big time, or 5 years, or 10 years feels like a lifetime. So no, very few people are able to make decisions objectively with their plus 10-year self in mind or plus 20-year self in mind. And that's ultimately what really matters. So I think I was able to grip that maybe a little bit better than other people. So I was able to say as well, like, right, I'm in this position. I'm only sacrificing 4 years. Worst case scenario, you come out the other end and you're a qualified doctor. Things could be worse. So all those things that we mentioned, but also that ability to maybe think across, what does this mean in a decade? What does this mean in 2 decades? That definitely helped me quite a bit, because that's always my vision. Is I don't worry too much about, you know, being happy or feeling good this year or next year. Like, and obviously it's important, but I'm not trying to maximize short-term pleasure. I'm trying to think in 10, 20, 30
You
years. And I
love
think that helps
delayed
me a lot.
gratification. You just love delaying that gratification till you're ready to enjoy it.
Yeah, I keep delaying it. it's, it's a bit too long now. No, I actually do enjoy my life. To be fair, I get both instant and delayed.
Yeah, exactly, but exactly that. But just making sure that you're not reliant on always seeking like instant short-term pleasure and reward, which I think we're all very guilty of in the way society is designed at the moment, and the way that our kind of chimp brain embraces it as well. One of the
100%.
things that's probably striking a lot of people during this conversation that haven't like heard of you before, Gary, is you come across as wise for your age, and you're talking there quite maturely about this longer term view. You've had an interest in philosophy and psychology from a young age, clearly. And one of the phrases that has always stood out within your content is too easy or too EZ. Where did
Yeah,
this
yeah.
come from and what does it mean?
Too easy, yeah. So it's yeah, basically we for those listening, like I often write the number two and then easy, the letters, so too easy, of course. Um, I actually it's kind of satire, but also kind of serious in that, it's satire because I'll often use it in terms of being talking about something that's clearly very difficult and challenging, and just saying, oh yeah, it's too easy. But also because I actually find it to be, I guess, a bit of a summary of maybe a more complex psychological or philosophical approach where people always talk about it. If you can believe it, you can achieve it, or you can do anything you want, whatever it happens to be. Um but for me, like, I do find that if I can go into things thinking that this is achievable, this is going to be too easy, like I do actually say it to myself, like if I've got a difficult day ahead, or I've got an exam that I'm going into, this is too easy. It's like a bit of reassurance for me. But it's also true in some sense, in that when we're encountering very challenging events, we almost always think they're going to be much worse than they are. Exams are the classic example of that, or a subject that you're learning is a classic example of that. Because when you're if I'm go let's say I'm going into my final year of medicine now, that's an incredibly challenging year, but you can only take one day at a time. So that's the way I try to think. And I go into each day saying, okay, this is going to be too easy. And if I break it down, it doesn't seem overwhelming anymore. Whereas if I look at the year as a whole, I look at, I don't know how many exams we have, maybe 20, 25 across the year, or something like that, like a reckless amount of content that we have to learn, to move all over the country on placements and this type of thing. Totally overwhelming. But if I can just think of, okay, what do I have to do tomorrow? Can I put that down on the to-do list? That's too easy. No problem. And focus on that going into each day with that attitude, these wins just begin to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And suddenly you're looking back being like, whoa, how did I get here? So it helps me to not get too caught up in my own head. And I have a kind of a personal approach to stress management that I'm genuinely not sure, like, how applicable this is to other people, because I talked to my girlfriend about it and I'm like, are you able to do this? And that is, I choose when to stress about things. So for example, if I have an assignment due on Monday and I haven't started it yet and it's Wednesday today, I genuinely won't feel any stress about that, because I say, right, I'm going to stress about this on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. And then I wake up and it's Saturday morning and it's 9 a.m. and it's like, right, now let's do the assignment. And I genuinely don't actually feel any stress outside of the time that I've allotted to it. And I think maybe part of that is practice, part of it's maybe like personal psychological traits, and part of it is just that it actually does work if you try to compartmentalize your life a little bit. So that's something that helps me, along with the kind of too easy mindset.
There's an element of self-fulfilling prophecy to this.
Yeah.
So if, for example, you looked at your final year of medicine and all the different hurdles and the content to consume and the different placements all across the country, and you told yourself, this is going to be stressful, that's the term you've just used there,
Yeah.
then best believe it's probably going to be stressful, and
Yeah.
not just within the compartmentalized state that you've decided it's going to be, but instead you choose to use language too easy, and it
Yeah.
becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not too
100%.
easy necessarily. That's slightly tongue-in-cheek, isn't it? We
Of
know
course.
that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you're saying it's going to be too easy. In fact, this is within my wheelhouse. This is within my capabilities. This is too easy. Gary will do this. This is going to happen. And the fascinating thing about the compartmentalization stress piece is that you're deciding when that task is going to get done and when your systems and mind and hormones and everything are going to turn on to it. So, for
Exactly.
example, you're like, on a really basic fitness example, you've got this horrible grueling leg session coming up. The stress for that should not be starting the day before. It
Yes.
does for some people though. Or you've got this photo shoot booked for 10 weeks time. The stress for that should not be starting like 10 weeks out. It should be just a kind of cumulative process of working towards it. And then maybe you get butterflies the hours of the times before it. If I've got a big podcast interview with a guest that I'm a little bit nervous, either speaking to on an intellectual level or in terms of a status level, my stress levels for it should be low. And hopefully I can manage it through preparation, research, role play, practice, all these different factors that I can do in advance that prepare me for it. I guess where people would maybe struggle, and I think maybe what your girlfriend's fed back to you and asked you, is if it's something that's like looming, like a deadline for an exam or a piece of coursework, I guess the stress level will kick up because it is inherently a stressful experience that you need to go through for a period.
Yeah.
But the fact that you're able to be like, not now, not now. There's other things to be stressed about first. And when the time comes, my stress levels will elevate to allow me to perform at a good level. And again, that's language like I would flip, like if I'm nervous before a big podcast, I'm actually excited. It's going to give me energy to speak clearly, to be on my toes, to move quickly. And that's one of the reasons that for those that are listening, I stand for a lot of podcasts because I feel more agile and more able to be on my toes intellectually too.
100%. And yeah, my girlfriend will ask me sometimes, oh, did you start that assignment? Like, how are you feeling about that? And I will explicitly say, I'm not thinking about that now. Don't ask me about that. Now is not the time to be thinking about that. And I think a lot of people sometimes I think they do themselves dirty by making their life seem more stressful than it is. Like if I was sitting here telling you about how stressful my life is and all these things I have to do, and I want to convince you that my life is stressful. I know that my life is stressful. I don't need to convince you. I don't want it to be in that dynamic of our conversation because that just gets me in a heightened state. And then I leave the podcast where we were just talking about how stressed I am, feeling stressed. Whereas if we're just talking more casually, whatever we're talking about, then I can leave here being like, oh, that was an enjoyable conversation, and then decide that tomorrow I'll worry about whatever's on the to-do list. I find that a lot of people online, before they actually have that much going on, they kind of posture in such a way on their social media to say that they're so incredibly busy, so incredibly stressed, and they're almost spending more time worrying about the task that needs to be done than actually just doing the task. And I think part of that has maybe been forced upon me, where I've got so much to do that if I was to actually spend loads of time stressing about it, I wouldn't be able to do it because I wouldn't have enough time. So maybe there's a bit of that there too. But I definitely think that's an element of it.
You're probably a bit of a Ryan Holiday fan, I guess, from like Stoicism and things like that.
I would have read him years ago. I read his Ego is the Enemy, and I think I have the Daily Stoic there somewhere as well. But I've enjoyed reading and listening to Ryan speak as well.
I saw one of his quotes recently, and it's pretty similar to what you just said there. It takes like the same level of energy and the input to do the thing as it does to think about doing the thing.
Yeah.
So that's like super basic language, especially for somebody that studied all these Roman emperors. But it's incredibly true, isn't it? And sometimes we just need that really clear aphorism to be like, well, in the same way that like I could stress about this assignment, or I could just do it when it's time to do it. And like as humans, we are very bad for like being worried about something in advance of it and like talking ourselves into how difficult it's going to be. So we can use frameworks like too easy to be like, actually, like this will be too easy when it's the time to do it. But when it's time to do it, of course, you need to apply the effort rather than think so much about, oh, like, should I do it in this particular way or in that particular way? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a massive planner, but when it comes to action, like you just have to take it relentlessly.
100%. I'm with you.
In terms of the content you've consumed, I've named Ryan Holiday, but also I know that you've read a lot of Nassim Taleb's content as well on anti-fragility. How have you applied this in your life?
Well, firstly, for the viewers, here's Nassim Taleb's Incerto right behind me. It's that's like I think the collector's edition or whatever, the box set of the Incerto that my girlfriend got me, and it's a beautiful set of books. But so Taleb, I think he's a fantastic writer, a writer that I think you have to get used to, because I haven't found anyone that writes like him. It's almost like it's very chaotic and disjointed, but also when you put it all together, it makes sense. And yeah, I'm a big fan of his work, and I recommend it to a lot of people. From an anti-fragility perspective, I quite like that word. I like the way that Taleb talks about it, because what he says is that, you know, a system that is fragile will break down in response to stressors. A system that is resilient will remain the same and push on through in the presence of stressors. And then a system that is anti-fragile does the opposite. So it actually adapts to the presence of stressors. And there are certain systems that are inherently in certain categories, but there are many human traits that would be considered to be anti-fragile in nature. An easy example there being our muscles. We train our muscles, we stimulate them, we apply stress, and they are anti-fragile in the nature that they respond positively to those stressors, obviously up to a point of stimulus. More broadly, I suppose you can apply this principle to, I guess, how you live your life generally, and that's kind of what I've taken from Taleb, is that you want to prevent yourself. Well, basically, Taleb's overall philosophy, all his books are somewhat related to the philosophy of risk management. And if I think about the way I live my life, and, you know, we've talked about wearing different hats and that type of thing, that would be an example of risk management in some sense, because I'm not maximizing one singular domain. I've got a couple of different domains that can sustain me, so that if one of those was to fail tomorrow, I'm at the very least resilient, if not anti-fragile, in the sense that I can push on with the others. He talks about it obviously in relation to investment and finances as well, that if, you know, you put all your money in one stock and that stock drops, goodbye. Whereas if you're, you know, nicely diversified, and you notice a catastrophic event in the markets coming up in advance, that you can potentially be anti-fragile there as well. So but more broad, or more psychologically, I suppose, I think a lot of people have probably heard sayings or quotes that maybe demonstrate elements of anti-fragility, and that, I suppose, that the classic one would be going back to Nietzsche's what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a bit more context to that quote in the way that he wrote it, but overall, the idea there is that if you're receiving some sort of psychological stressors as a human being, you can actually get stronger and benefit from that. Now, of course, again, context dependent. People do experience post-traumatic stress disorder, but there is also, you know, post-traumatic growth that people can experience too. So I think that having a kind of that baked into your mindset, that you can get better in response to stress, again, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you don't view challenges such as exams or another year in college or other life stressors as inherently degrading, but rather something that builds you up and makes you a better person. And I think that's something that's both true and functional from a mindset perspective.
I'm a huge fan of when somebody takes such in-depth texts and then applies them across their life. And anyone listening to the first 40 minutes of this conversation will have heard you apply little bits of that framework throughout in terms of how you speak. And I think that's vitally important, because I think we see many people like flex about how many books they've read or how many self-development podcasts or whatever they listen to. But if you don't apply like even any of the lessons across it, then it's kind of all for nothing. It's like ego massage, or like intellectual masturbation, if you were to call it that. Whereas I think when you listen to you speak, many of the ideas that you've taken on board are now perforated throughout how you come across and how you live. And I love when you use a fitness example as well. I think many people can relate to that in terms of when I put stress on my muscles, they gain size. And it's funny how us fitness bros can actually have an interest in that particular area, but of course intellectually be well read and able to apply these concepts and then bring it back to the fitness bro example to really bring it to life as well, which I love too.
Exactly. And it's very true what you said, that like I encounter many people who will talk about how many books they read, but then you ask them what their favorite book is and you ask them to summarize it, and they haven't really got a clue. It was just more like a flex. And from my perspective, I think that one of the benefits of reading is that it actually makes you into the person that you are, that those ideas become part of you. And that's why you read the ideas of others. And you can see that Taleb in me, like there's definitely many other authors who have are part of me. Like Jordan Peterson's probably a very obvious one. You can see or hear when I speak that there are certain ideas that are very clearly influenced by him or Carl Jung or other people. But that's ultimately, I think, the purpose of reading broadly. Take those ideas, be influenced by others as if they're in your life, because, you know, people always say you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. But theoretically, the person you could spend the most time with could be someone that you just have read so much of their content, and their ideas become part of you. And I think that if you're deliberate about that process, it can really help your intellectual development, your social development. And that's just a real privilege that we have access to so many books, and not even books, YouTube videos these days. It's fantastic.
Yeah, we are swimming in information, and it's interesting that you bring up the fact that somebody maybe can't articulate what they've learned from a particular book. And you do lots of Q&As. I do a Q&A every 10 episodes in this podcast, and they're always really popular because I try not let myself take over the podcast. It's about the guest. It's very important you do that. So when you do a solo Q&A, they can like, right, Colin, tell us a bit more about this. And one of the questions was quite deep, and I think you'll like this, Gary. It was, why do we share what we learn? And the first was like was obviously to help people and support them, but the second for me is actually it's a little bit of an act of self-care in that respect, where if you can articulate and distill down an idea that you know and put it into terms that somebody else can understand and learn and get there quicker than you did, then it actually helps reinforce the lesson. So by you telling me all about Talib's content there and delving into some of the other self-development lessons that you've learned, even when you kind of recall from Man Search for Meaning, the kind of high-level details and the lessons it taught you, it reinforces those lessons inside your head as well. And by speaking them into existence, not saying that we're manifesting, it helps you to bring those to life as well, and put you in a position where you're like, well, actually, that idea is now even more crystal clear in my head. And it's reinforced what I read in that book by me being able to say it to a friend or a colleague that was asking me about it. So I love that when you have this knowledge in your head and then you speak it out and you teach people, it's almost doing a double favor. It helps them, but it's also helping you to reinforce and bring home those lessons that you learned for the first time for a second time.
100%. And I mean, it's kind of a classic as well in educational circles. Richard Feynman was a big fan of this, is that if you like your goal with trying to understand any subject should be to relay it on to someone else, and particularly to be able to do so in simple, basic terms that anyone can understand. And that's not always easy, obviously, but you know, he's a pioneer in physics. Richard Feynman, and he was well able to articulate those ideas. And he's got some excellent YouTube videos where he explains, you know, electromagnetism and all these things very simply, and it's just fantastic. And I find personally that that's one of the best ways to solidify my knowledge. And in some ways, answering the Q&As, like you said, and having to put out content on social media, it's been one of the best learning exercises ever for me, because I'm very uncomfortable like writing a post or answering a question if I, you know, don't know the answer, as in, unless I'm going to say I don't know, like I'm not going to answer it authoritatively otherwise. And very often if I'm getting answers, I'll look things up, I'll double check, or let's say before I use a quote, I'll go back to the book and say, was that definitely right? And that's just been amazing for me in terms of solidifying my knowledge and causing me to sometimes debunk ideas that I might have held, or leave ideas to the side that I might have held, because when I went back to them, I don't think that's true anymore. And that's really important.
Yeah, holding them loosely. So when you go back and revisit them, you're actually like the current version of Gary in August 22 when I'm recording this is different to the person that maybe read that for the first time. And like I've read books at different times in my life for the second time or the third time, whatever, and taken different things from them just based on where you're at that point. Now, one of the most common questions that I get asked, and you definitely get asked it, is around time management, in terms of like, how do you get everything done? And given everything you accomplish, one of the phrases I saw you say recently was, there's no hack to do more work. Why is that?
Yeah, there's no hack to do more work. I always come back to Parkinson's law here, and I've been asked this, and this is the question I get in every podcast, every Q&A that I do is how do you get so much done? I always say Parkinson's law, the time that it takes to commit or to complete a task is equal to the time that's allocated, or that it will swell to fill the time that's allocated. the idea there being that if you have 4 hours of work to do and you're going to be in the office for 12 hours, guess how long that 4 hours of work is going to take? It's going to take 12 hours. This is why deadlines work so well, why when we're under pressure, we work so effectively. We have a specific time that the task has to be done, and suddenly you get it all done. This is why people have final year projects that they might have been working on for 2 years at university, and they finish it in the last week or the last 2 weeks. They do 90% of the work, because most things don't take that long. And when you're under time pressure, you can do a hell of a lot of work. And it's not that I always have specific deadlines as such, but rather that because I have a lot of things going on that are in different domains, there are some pillars. So, for example, I had to be in the hospital this morning. I had to be here for the podcast with you. I had a meeting with Paddy at 4. So there were different pillars in my day around which I had to structure it then. So I had my meeting with Paddy at 4. I wanted to go out for a walk, a weighted walk for my exercise session today. So I said, right, I got home at 2:30. I need to go right now, get that done. So I'm back for 4. Otherwise, I won't get it done. So because there's that additional time pressure, there's far less of that kind of just buffer time between tasks for me, where, you come home from the office and you say, oh, I'm going to relax and go to the gym in a half an hour, and a half an hour turns into an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then you've lost 2 hours. And during that 2 hours, had you had other things to do, those things would have gotten done. So it's just about making the most of the time that's available and somewhat being forced to make the most of that time too. So if I've got 10 tasks to do and I only have 10 hours, well, they have to get done. That's it. So I don't really think there's that much else to it. Like, there definitely are some strategies that I implement in terms of being deliberate with planning when I'll do particular things. The stress comment that I mentioned previously about deciding when I'll stress about things. And yeah, I think that's most of it, along with the fact that I don't really do anything that doesn't contribute to those tasks getting done other than training. I'm not sitting down watching Netflix for 4 hours or, dilly-dallying on my phone for 2 hours on the couch. It just doesn't really happen.
Yeah, I'm very, very similar, and some people find it quite difficult to hear that message in terms of like, oh, I don't massively procrastinate. Like, there's certain things I procrastinate on,
Yeah,
and I think you and I share this quality when I've heard you speak about this before. But my type of procrastination tends to differ, so I'd be interested, like, what does procrastination look like for Gary McGowan?
Yeah, so I actually that's actually something I should have mentioned, is that, and I'm glad you've done your research, because I did talk about this before, where I talked about procrastination, and I said that procrastination can actually be of benefit, and that you can yield it to your benefit. And my life is structured in such a way that procrastination can actually be used for positive effects. So if I'm procrastinating on doing my triage work, very often I might do like some medicine multiple choice questions. Or if I'm procrastinating on a medical assignment that I do, I might be doing triage work instead, or something along those lines. So because there's other things that at the moment have less friction between me and that task, that feels like procrastination to me, but it's still productive and taking something off my to-do list. So what I tell people is that when you think of procrastination, what you've got is a layer of friction between you and the task that's currently too great for you to overcome it, or at least that's how it feels to you. There are multiple other domains or directions in which there is less friction, and that could be what most people do is just scroll on their phone or watch TV or something like that. But it could just as easily be reading a book or working on something else, because there is less friction in that direction. There mightn't be less friction than, for example, watching the TV, but it's enough you can overcome that bit of friction now. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it's like different levels of procrastination. There's like the really cheap, instantly rewarding, easily accessible procrastination of the dopamine from our phone, or watching something that feels reassuring, or there's reading or answering these particular emails, or doing something that's still on the to-do list, but albeit feels easier within that moment.
Yeah.
And I spoke to Niriel on the podcast, who wrote Indistractable, and he is very big on the fact that when we procrastinate or don't do things that we said we're going to do and get distracted, it's to escape discomfort. And the discomfort is the layer of friction between ourselves and the task. And I recognized after reading his book, and then particularly after interviewing him, again, by speaking it into existence, I reinforced the lessons. When I'm writing like a difficult proposal or email in work, I'll go like stop and like reply to a LinkedIn message. I'll post on LinkedIn. I will reply to an internal email to a supplier that's going to help me out with a particular deal because it's easier. I'm escaping this discomfort. I'm running away from the fact that the words won't come immediately to my fingers to write this particular email where I'm trying to land like a price increase or something like that. And I'll go and do something which is still work, but it's easier, lower level work. And sometimes like, I've definitely learned I need to sit with that discomfort and just be like, fucking grip in, Colin, like, and do the work. But my level of procrastination from it is at least not reaching for Instagram or going to the kitchen and eating or trying to escape from it in that sense. At least it's like it's a form of procrastination which I don't like, but it's at least not a form of procrastination that's destructive, which I think a lot of people go immediately to. So like the levels to the procrastination piece is fascinating for me to hear somebody else articulate it that is maybe wired in a slightly similar way to me, where I don't like to feel like I'm not being productive in some sense.
100%. And I think to be fair, like in your work, let's say where you've got a couple of different tasks that could be considered to be productive, or my work very similar, I think it's a little bit easier for us. It's difficult for some people. Maybe like, I think the college student who has one assignment to do is the classic example, because for college students with one assignment, it's either assignment or, you know, Netflix, TV, drinking, smoking weed.
Go in the rip, yeah.
There's no other productive thing that they're doing other than that one assignment. So what I'll often tell people to do then is like, there's generally something to do with that assignment that has the largest friction. So you break it down. And I often do this if I have an assignment to do. I take everything we've talked about and I put it on a more micro level. So for example, it might be that there's this one section that I can't approach now. There's just too much friction. Let's say you're writing up a paper or something, but you might be able to write up some of the method sections. Or if you don't want to write the whole, paragraph, take a few notes and bullet points. And even if it's just 5 minutes, because I'll often do that at nighttime in particular. If there was something I know I procrastinated on, what I'll do is I'll take 5 minutes at the end of the day and I'll do the most minuscule, start to that task, write down 4 bullet points and then go to bed. And then in the next morning, wake up and it's like, oh, at least it started. At
You've
least
given yourself a head start. I love that. I've heard a lot of authors say that they'll sometimes stop mid-sentence when they're writing a book, so that when they come back to it, they finish that sentence and then you've generated momentum to go from there. Equally, one of my favorite productivity things is the 2-minute rule, where if I'm doing a task and I know it would only take 2 minutes, just do it now. Like wash the dishes after you have dinner. Don't just leave them on the table, because like if you just go through and get it out of the way now, it's done, and then you can go on to a task that's more important or higher leverage or better. Equally, you can sometimes end up in like a spinning like vortex of like small shitty tasks, like answering particular emails if you do the 2-minute rule. But I just like to feel like I'm doing things to free up greater freedom for Colin in the future. Of course, I think you and I could potentially end up delaying the gratification too long at times. I think that's maybe how we're predispositioned in that sense.
We're probably wired in that direction. But that's a good point about like, household chores, because that's actually something I'm trying to work on at the moment, is like that, like you say, that 2-minute rule. Like if it can be done now, just do it now. Because what happens with me very often is, let's say I let a few of those things pile up to the point where maybe there's an hour of household chores to be done. An hour, not a big deal, right? Not a big deal. But if I've got a load of stuff going on, then doing that hour of chores genuinely seems just like too much. I'm like, I genuinely don't have an hour. And then it becomes an hour and a half, and then it becomes 2 hours, and then it's 3 weeks later and you have to do all this catch up around the house. So that's something I'm actually trying to prioritize. Like it's very at the front of my mind at the moment, is if something is done or if something is there to be done, do it right now. Don't leave that which can be done today until tomorrow.
Once it's done, it frees up the bandwidth that you and I are stretched on. And most people listening to this are busy people.
Yeah.
If you free up the bandwidth by doing the thing now, then you move forward. And we can go back to that Ryan Holiday quote. It takes just as much time and energy and effort to think about doing the thing as it does to do the thing. So sometimes you just need to crack on, out the way, and then you free up yourself to do something else. You come from Ireland, Gary, and I come from Glasgow in Scotland. And I think there's some commonalities between the two nations in particular. And sometimes people could be uncomfortable when people start to pursue something different or even just self-betterment. And
Yeah.
you're somebody that's indexed really hard on self-development. And the kind of people that are playing this through their car speaker or their AirPods just now are the kind of people that are pursuing self-betterment as well. But they can sometimes come up against friction. And one of the main areas that I've noticed friction, and I believe you have as well, is when you try and work on the skill of speaking well and not having too strong of an accent, you can sometimes be seen as like patronizing or like leaving your roots behind. Because while you can definitely hear that I'm Scottish, you can definitely hear that you're Irish, you and I are not massively regional speakers in that sense. And some people can get a bit uncomfortable with that. And I know people come up against barriers in that sense. How do you strike the balance between pursuing self-betterment and improvement and speaking well and not being like patronizing or looking down upon your peers?
Yes, my parents even point this out. They'll say, "You've got a bit of an American twang in those videos that you're doing," but it's mostly lighthearted. I have had a few, you know, backhanded comments in terms of maybe I've heard of people talking about me, or on some of those, anonymous kind of messaging forums and stuff, people saying that I'm what did they say? I have a superiority complex and all this sort of thing, and he thinks he's better than everyone and he speaks like he's an American and whatever. But to be honest, I think that I think there's a few different reasons why it is important to be clearly spoken. Number one, if I'm with my friends at home in Kerry, my Kerry accent really starts to get strong and I start to speak really fast. And that's just not great experience for someone that's trying to listen to me. What I also am cognizant of always when putting out content is that I've actually got one client currently who's deaf. I've got a number of other clients or followers who are deaf, and I've spoken to them in the DMs about this. That having captions on actually helps them a lot. And if I'm using my normal Kerry accent and speaking fast, those captions are picking up all sorts of wild things. So that's one of the reasons why I try to speak clearly and will really try to, pronounce certain parts of a word so that it's picked up by any captioning devices. And also just appreciating that some people are listening from other countries. And if I'm using, a specific, if I'm speaking in a particular way, like you listen to some people from Glasgow or Scotland or Northern Ireland as well speaking, or some parts of rural Kerry where I'm from, most people won't be able to understand them if they're from there. It's very difficult. So all those things have influenced my, I guess, somewhat conscious, somewhat subconscious decision to try to be very clear in the way that I speak. So yeah, all of those things, I guess, have influenced it. I definitely made a conscious effort to speak better. Generally, if I'm giving a presentation or something, I'll try to maybe rehearse in advance. I won't have notes, but I want to make sure that I know some of the words that I'll use, that I'll know some of the transitions between sentences and slides, etc. And I think all of those things help with effective communication. Personally, I don't really ever get too bothered about what people might think of me locally or something, or maybe some people won't like me. Of course, it bothers everyone, and there's certain things people could say that I'd think, oh God, that one hurts, because I think there might be a bit of truth there. But that's okay with it. It's okay with me because like I am 1000% a harsher critic of myself than anyone could ever be. So I've dealt with that. And to be honest, I think what you realize is that although you get a bit of a slagging when you try to maybe go on this self-betterment path, as you say, whether it's related to how you speak or any other number of attributes, you get a bit of slagging. But most of your real friends will still be there. Your family will still be there. Most people that actually care about you and that you care about want to see you do well, even if there's an initial bit of slagging and maybe they feel a bit insecure themselves. That's fine, because ultimately your real friends do last. And that's something I've always found, is that I don't pretend to my friends to be anything that I'm not. I think some people do, and this gets them in a bit of trouble when they're on the self-betterment path, because online, let's say, their social media persona is one thing, and then in real life they still try to be the guy that their boys thought they were when he was 16.
I think we'll both met people like that who put on a facade, but I think when it comes to like trying to be more articulate and well spoken and more easily understood, and it's a very low hanging fruit to do that. And Peterson, who we both referenced throughout this conversation, is very big on being able to write and speak, and it's a bit of a superpower. And in this world where you can create written or video or audio content, why not have that as a skill? And equally in my day job, Gary, being known as a good presenter who can present to clients from different parts of England, different parts of Wales, different parts of the continent in Europe, and be well known as like, oh, he's the Scottish guy, but they can understand me. It's been very beneficial for me. And if I look at the podcast demographics, as I'm sure you will with your demographics on Instagram or whatever, not everyone comes from this tiny little region that we potentially live in to start with.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had that exact same experience, particularly since starting medicine. Like if you're presenting to someone in a hospital, you go into any hospital and you'll see that there's people from all parts of the world working as doctors. Like they're not just Irish doctors. And I've had experiences like that where I was, taught anatomy at one point by this, surgeon who was an excellent surgeon, extremely competent, unbelievable knowledge of anatomy, but I couldn't understand him, because, I don't know where he was from, but he was from another country and his accent was difficult for me to understand. And the speed at which he spoke was difficult for me to understand. So as a result, I didn't benefit from that. And, I wouldn't go back to him for help just for that reason, because it's just not an easy transaction there. And it's very similar if I was to use my full Kerry accent and speak, super quickly, like I would if I was with some of the boys at home, then, they'd miss out on things that I was saying too. So it is a superpower. I think the ability to speak clearly and articulate yourself is a superpower that's transferable to many different domains. And that's been one of my probably biggest strengths throughout university is anytime I give a presentation, it always leaves a very, positive impression, or at least the vast majority of the time. And I'm okay saying that because it's reflected in the grades and reflected in the feedback I've been given. And it's not anything inherent to me. It maybe there's part of it, but I've worked on that over and over and over again. And I always say to people, if you're shy at speaking, you need to speak more. Or if you're bad at speaking, you need to speak more. If you're too shy to go on social media and post videos, just start doing it. A year down the line, it won't matter. You won't even realize why you were shy.
100%. And that's like seeking change and betterment from like a mental and a skill level perspective. We were laughing before we hit record about seeking change from a physical perspective. Has fat loss become like a gateway to the alt-right, Gary?
Yeah, I think it has. Unfortunately, there's a lot of guys, joining the KKK and the neo-Nazis as a result of starting German volume training these days. No, in all seriousness, what you're getting at here is the idea that the pursuit of maybe self-improvement or the adoption of personal responsibility for one's own life has become sort of intertwined with the political right wing. And of course, there are personality traits that correlate with political beliefs, and that would then correlate with some of these, personal beliefs about one's psychological approach to life, I guess you could say. But I think these are absolutely not right wing beliefs to take personal responsibility or whatever, or to just be, motivated and disciplined in your life. They are intertwined in some cases, but it's not something I would take very seriously. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of people do think that these days, that the pursuit of fat loss or improvement, there's a lot of just really strange beliefs that people hold, saying that if you try to lose fat, that is inherently fat phobic, because you're deciding that another person that is fat like you were is of less value. But that's not what you're saying. You're just saying that there is some sort of hierarchy here. And if you can't acknowledge that there's some sort of hierarchy in terms of being leaner, generally in most cases, on average in the population, being better than being fatter, then you're totally deluded from my perspective. Because I don't think any serious person, any average lay person on the street would turn around and say, oh, it's actually better to be fatter. So there is an implicit hierarchy there in terms of one's beliefs that people are scared to make explicit. And I think that's because they think that's going to make or create extra weight stigma, or it makes them feel like maybe it's inherently stigmatizing is fine. I don't think that's the case, because I think I work with a lot of people towards their fat loss goals, and regardless of where someone starts, regardless of how fit or unfit someone is, they're all going to get treated with the same level of compassion and respect, because from my perspective, all people at base are of equal value. But that doesn't mean that we all live ways that are of equal merit or of equal virtue, and we can all move in that direction. I think there are better and worse ways to live. I think that you have to kind of believe that, unless you're going to be total anarchist. There are better and worse ways to live. There are better and worse ways to exist or perform or look, and we can't achieve the best in all of those domains. But it doesn't mean, just because we mightn't get to the North Pole, doesn't mean we don't need to know where north and south is, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, exactly that. And like, geography is a very like binary subject, but we appear to be blurring the lines between so many different distinctions nowadays. And I find it fascinating that during the kind of last couple of years, where there has been a lot of challenges to like people's freedoms and how they felt about particular restrictions and things that have gone on, and mandates or whatever else, kind of people within the fitness community being quite like independent and able to like take personal responsibility has almost been deemed like a negative thing during this period. And I find it very interesting how some of the language has changed around being mindful about your health to like protect albeit growing subsection of the population that are not looking after themselves from that perspective, and making them feel comfortable has been like the number one goal of how language has been treated nowadays when it comes to things like fat loss and weight loss. And I think fit shaming, if anything, is like quite a common new occurrence than fat shaming. Like when I was at school, fat shaming would absolutely have been a thing. Like you would have been bullied for being overweight. But I from the when I've coached kids groups at summer camps and things like that in previous jobs, like it's much more the other way, where like kids are almost mocked for being like too active or like being too into sports nowadays. It's just a bizarre setup that we've kind of enabled within the next generation that are coming through.
Yeah, I always wonder how it influences the next generation, but I definitely see it in the fitness world, because when I talk about these things, it always clicks with people. They're like, oh my God, like I think particularly young trainers who have genuinely good intentions and are just really nice people. Sometimes people can be too nice for their own good. And I know a lot of people like this who are actually scared to talk about fat loss or to share their clients' transformations and these types of things, because they know that, some people that follow them will attack them and say, oh, but, diets don't really work, and you're putting that person at risk of an eating disorder and all these types of things. And I think it is those people that are maybe too nice for their own good that end up allowing their language to go in the direction of, things that they mightn't actually believe in. And that's why the idea of being a nice person and the idea of being a good person aren't necessarily the same thing. Because if you're
100%.
aiming at the good, again, you can see Peterson's influence here. If you're aiming at the good, you have to be, dangerous in some sense, or dangerous but disciplined, if you will. And you have to be willing to at least stand up for your beliefs and say no when you feel others are crossing the line. And I think there's virtue in that. And I think in this case, a lot of people allow their language to go in the direction of people who they don't actually believe with, or they don't actually, believe, or whether it's putting your pronouns in bio, or talking about your privilege or whatever. Maybe you genuinely support these things. Absolutely. More power to you. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people just do these things as almost signals to the group.
And it's for an easy life as well. It's for an easy life, because by not doing these things, you're much more likely to be shouted down and harassed and called a bigot. And some of the people that I know who shout these things and get so angry are among the most prejudiced people in terms of their like the way that they behave. And I find it fascinating. Like, look at Adele's a really good example. When she went through her weight loss, so many people like attacked her for leaving the group and the demographic that she was primarily associated with growing up as being the lady that was quite overweight but had a really good voice and was really talented, and she could be a leading pop star despite the fact she was overweight. But when she lost the weight, they were like, well, actually, I'm not comfortable with that, because I put you in that box as somebody that was like an ally or a supporter of overweight people. And you're like, well, actually, she's healthier now. She's going to live longer. maybe she can contribute even more to the music scene and support people with her talent by being healthier, and maybe she feels better. Like, who are you to tell her how to feel at that point? And I think like fit shaming when it comes to that kind of thing, when you leave the group or the demographic that people had kind of boxed you into, or your identity, which we spoke about at the very start of this discussion, it makes other people feel super uncomfortable, and then you become an enemy of the kind of the politically correct elite that we're moving towards.
100%. And I mean, like, that circles right back to what we said at the beginning, you know, about the identity. And you see this all the time these days, particularly on social media, because people don't often really know what they're promoting or what they're supporting, but will do so anyway as a signal to other people. This happens both on the right and on the left. It's not just in one direction. But what I see more often, in at least in medicine, because I suppose doctors and people in healthcare more generally tend to, you know, be more left wing, of course. You know, I'll see, you know, doctors with the pronouns in bio and the standards, you know, arsenal, where they've got the Ukraine flag, you know, they've got hashtag BLM, all these things that are just almost just reproducible. Like, if I see that, I can predict all of your beliefs about every topic. Like, and that's such a dangerous position to be in. And I received a bit of pressure that time around the death of George Floyd, because we had, you know, we schedule our posts in advance very often at Triage, and we had a post that went out on that day, and people got on to me and said, you know, you need to take that down. You need to post a black square and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, why exactly? Can you explain to me why I'm supposed to do this? And I wasn't, you know, really given any great answer, to be honest. And it was just, again, it was just a signal. And, you know, I'm not saying that you're a bad person if you did that, but rather that you being just going along with signals in that way, signaling to other people without having knowledge of actually what you stand for. I think that's actually very dangerous, because in this case, all right, maybe not so dangerous. Someone shares a Ukraine flag, all right, fair enough, whatever. But if you go in that direction, or in any direction, very easily, you get pulled towards very dangerous ideas in some cases. You see that in right wingers on the far right as well, where people will play around with certain ideas, and it's funny and it's banter. And then suddenly you have one of these guys that takes it too seriously and goes and shoots up a school, and it's like, holy shit, what did he do? And again, it's just one example of people wanting to adhere to a particular set of beliefs, impress the others,
Conform to the tribe, Gary. Exactly, fit in with whatever the ideology is at that point in time. And I think that's absolutely right. And equally, like, when you see what I would call virtue signaling, which is the concept which we're discussing just now, how many people keep up the virtue from the initial signal? So how many people who posted the black square are still actively involved in anti-racism? How many people who share the Ukraine flag are actually supporting refugees coming across from Ukraine to house them or support them or anything like that? And it's a cheap signal to throw up a social media post at a point in time where other people are doing it. And that's not to call people out, but equally, I think, like, I've got quite a disagreeable personality. I've done some of the personality testing, and I would much rather be actively supportive of a cause that I truly believe in than just jump on the next bandwagon and lend very low level, like low impact support.
100%. And I mean, like, that's always my perspective, is I try not to share signals that I think are cheap, or signals that get me out of doing something in the real world. So I would always be of the opinion, you know, that, like, do real charity work, give your time up, actually do something that's meaningful in the world, rather than just, you know, signaling thoughts and prayers. Okay, what now? Like,
people find that very difficult though, Gary, and like, you would potentially get called out that you hadn't put up the Ukraine flag, or you hadn't supported a particular movement in some sense. But I know that, like, you've done like things like the Brown Chernobyl project, or you've actively given up time and like made significant like sacrifices from that perspective. And some of the people that I know that kind of get called out for not being like supportive or like in somebody's eyes charitable, actually are doing a lot of charity work either behind the scenes or actively. And you're like, oh well, like, their contribution, if you are looking at it from a binary sense, is greater than your sharing of an Instagram story that felt good in that moment because you were part of the group of people that were trying to feel virtuous about themselves.
Yeah, 100%. It's just in group signaling is what it is. And I think that you should try, at the very least, you might come to the conclusion that it is worth it and that it's a good thing and that you do it all from a good, genuine, altruistic place if that exists. But I think that in any case where you're signaling, just question your motives and ask yourself, is this genuinely something I believe? Is it genuinely something I understand? Like, for example, like the phrase Black Lives Matter is absolutely innocuous and something that no one would actually disagree with. Like, yes, obviously, like, okay, there might be some, freaks out there that actually do disagree with that, but most people agree with that. The question is, to what extent do you agree with the motives and the processes of that organization? And I know loads of people that just share Black Lives Matter, all these different posts and stuff, and they don't know who's behind the organization. They don't know where the funding is going. They don't know what they actually stand for, what they're fighting for, etc. And I just think that's incredibly dangerous because, like, if it was on, let's say, if it was right wingers that were doing this type of thing and they were, I don't know, fundraising for some very disagreeable cause that they didn't like, and people didn't look into it and they didn't consider what it was actually for, then that would clearly be a travesty. And I think there were examples that emerged from that maybe the funding wasn't going to the best places and those types of things. But yeah, like, again, I'm not saying I'm anti
People were swept
BLM.
along. Yeah,
Yeah, but people get
were
swept
swept
along
along.
because they're too nice and they're not disagreeable like you and me.
Yeah. But I think you have a tremendous level of self-awareness, and I certainly think in the last 2.5 years, particularly from doing the podcast, and I've done quite a lot of journaling as well. Which, if you said to Colin like 3-4 years ago, you're going to be journaling, I'd be like, you've absolutely lost the plot. But I've certainly found that, like, going into myself and understanding a bit more about how I'm wired has made me much more able to articulate things, and I'm a much better, more helpful person to be around because I understand how I'm wired and I can maybe help others. Like, there's a great
Absolutely.
phrase, like, a rising tide raises all ships. So if I can perform at my best and look after myself to my best, then I take other people with me. And I certainly think that that's something that you are clearly doing in your life, Gary. And I guess to kind of bring us home, one of the questions that I like to ask some, I guess, particularly somebody that's as studious and keen to, like, improve themselves as you, what's one thing that you still feel you're constantly learning even now?
Constantly learning. Let me think. I think what I'm constantly learning is where what the sweet spot is for me between work and play, I guess you could say. More work and play, but also maybe uh, time with myself and time in my own head is another element of that, because I definitely swing in the direction almost always of working too much and always wanting to do too much. That's my tendency. So I've worked very hard on trying to pull that back a bit. And I think one of the things I've learned and continue to learn is that, like, for me at least, it's not the work and the play. Like, if I finish work and I don't know, I don't really want to go and do loads of activities or spend lots of time with different people, or like, I enjoy some of that, but I think one of my needs is some of that time alone, maybe out for a long walk, processing my thoughts, or reading a book that maybe causes me to consider, certain elements of my own life or whatever it happens to be. Just some part of my day or my life, my week, that is silent, or silent with maybe some pleasant thoughts, or just, floating thoughts, if you will, where I can be a bit more free in my own head. I think that's one of the things I've learned that I need a little bit more of, and some play as well, for sure. But yeah, that's for me, is learning where that sweet spot lies.
When
And
did you start to explore that then, Gary? Because prominently enough, at the time of recording, you shared a post today about a time that 5-6 years ago that you took it too far, and, like, you had adverse reactions with your eye bleeding, and you'd had nosebleeds before from kind of pushing too far. When did you start to actively explore that I need to learn about this? And of course, you're still learning, but when was it a realization that, right, okay, now it's time to work on this?
yeah, well, I've always at least had the awareness that, I probably tilted in the direction of working too hard. I knew I had that tendency, and I always, I would speak to clients about this all the time, where I know theoretically that, you need time to relax, or you need time to play and enjoy yourself to make this a sustainable lifestyle. Like, I know that theoretically, but I think it's probably maybe only in the last few months, really, actually, where that last piece has actually come into the puzzle, where I've realized that, when I feel much more put together, much more aligned, if you will, when I have that time to, just be alone, both physically and mentally as well. I think that's probably more so in the last few months. I think over the last 2 years, maybe, has been more so thinking about taking more time off and doing more things that weren't work. But it's just that last piece where I think that need for introspection and isolation that's something is very, very new, I would say, even though I used to do it a lot before, especially when I was younger, but now it feels a bit more prominent.
When you're so busy, it's kind of hard to like find that time, but finding that time enables you to be better during the periods when you're meant to be doing the things that you decide that you're going to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting, just as an aside, do you remember Lex Griffin? He was like the first Gymshark athlete, the guy with the beard.
Oh, yes.
I met Lex through a shoot that I did for Slater Menswear, talking about men's mental health, and he told me that one of the things that he does, and at the time, again, I would have thought like this is like a bit different. Like he likes grounding, but he also likes like just walking in nature, no music, no phone. And because he's somebody that spends time creating content all the time on his phone or his camera, it's like so revolutionary to not have anything in your ears or anything in your hand or anything stimulating you. So he comes back from these walks and he's like, wow, well, I'm going to do a video on this. I'm going to do all these different things, because he's had like time to not have any input. So his brain is just like working in a way that's like so much more helpful. And I imagine like people like you and I, we were speaking about, tending towards like doing too much work and like trying to fit too much in. When you have those times where there's nothing happening, it almost like revitalizes you for the times when it's time to go.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's very much in line with my own experience. The walk in nature is the pinnacle example of like that if I can walk in nature on my own in silence, like that definitely makes me feel very good psychologically. And I like Lex. I actually kind of forgot he existed, because he's one of the OGs, but I went back and watched one of his videos there maybe just a few months ago, because he popped into my head. But yeah, I always found him to be a very nice guy, at least it seems so. And I think I really like the fact that he was always very unique and seems to very much be his own person, as opposed to just trying to adhere to what other fitness influencers do. And I always have respect for people who do that.
You've nailed that. And we were mentioning before, like people being their authentic selves and like not necessarily having like a facade online and like trying to self-development online, but then being what they are, being totally different offline. He is exactly as you would expect him to be, which is very refreshing to experience that. And I certainly think you are as well, Gary, because when you go for over an hour in a podcast, nothing ends up hidden, does it? It all comes out, because we can't act for longer than that. But Gary, people have loved this conversation as much as I have, I'm sure, and they'll want to continue the conversation with you. Where should they head towards?
Yeah, so it's probably the best places are at Skinny Gaz or at Triage Method on Instagram. My personal page is Skinny Gaz. My business page, along with my colleagues, is at Triage Method. Or you can email me at gary@triagemethod.com if you don't have Instagram, or you want to send me a longer message. That's perfectly fine. Always happy for anyone to email. So
amazing, Gary. Those will be linked in the show notes, guys. Thank you very much for joining us as always, and I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.